Hey guys, welcome back to The Deep. This week we have a very unique movie, and with me is a very awesome person to talk about it with me. This is Ashley Jasmer from WDWNT fam. Ashley, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing great. So, first of all, thanks for doing this with me. And I came, you and I talked about this and said, what
Mhm.
movie would we do? And you actually suggested this one, and you suggested
Walt and El Grupo, I think is how you correctly pronounce it.
that is that is correct. So here's like just my weird thing about this movie is that I don't usually love documentaries. I like them, but if it's a Disney thing, I love a documentary. Imagineering
Mhm.
story. I made my way through that whole thing 3 times because it was so good. So I love any information about Disney and about Walt. I've never watched this one before though, and part of it is that I always saw the title and saw it as Walt and El Guapo, which it's not. I mean, it clearly says El Grupo, but El Guapo
Yeah.
is the character from Three Amigos, so that was weird.
hmm
And it just seemed weird to say El Grupo until you actually watch the movie and get how it's worked out. So this is the first documentary we've ever done. The other thing is that I'm a little bit out of my element because usually I'll go, oh, and this actor was also in this movie, and this voice actor did this, and he was in the parks, or they have this attraction. There's no real ties to this, so this is like straight up documentary territory. So I'm gonna rely a lot on you.
Yeah. No, it's really great. So I actually watched it when it first came out, I think in '08, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yep.
And I hadn't seen it until I was trying to come up with something for this, and I was actually just scrolling through um Disney Plus, and it came up on my recommended. Not really sure why, other than maybe, I mean, I do enjoy, especially like you said, the Disney documentary. So, I of course watched the Imagineering story. I've made my way back through The Boys and Waking Sleeping Beauty are two of my other favorites.
Mm.
That to me are just fascinating. And so I think that's probably why it's suggested. But I didn't quite remember it. I thought it would be interesting, and I wasn't wrong. It's definitely a story that not many people are aware of. That he went on this goodwill tour to South America and how that came about.
Yeah, I think they sort of undersell the importance of this thing. I mean,
Yeah.
the government comes to him and says, "Hey, we want you to do a goodwill tour," and he's like, "I'm not really sure I'm going to do that." And they're like, "Okay, well, we'll pay for you to go and study the countries and make these movies." And it just happened like as I'm wrapping my head around this documentary, I wish they had kind of outlined the timeline because the timeline to me is very interesting. 1939, World War II starts. We're not in it yet. May 1941, and they talk about this a little bit, is the animation strike that happens at
hmm
Disney Studios. And then the Goodwill Tour happens in August of 41. They come back in October of 41, and then Pearl Harbor happens in December of 41. So it's a crazy time for this to be happening.
Right. Yeah. No, it definitely is. And I would agree with that, that it does get a little confusing with, especially with the timeline, because they kind of, they don't really set the scene all that great. They mention the strike and how, Disney was kind of apprehensive, but at the same time kind of wanted to get away because of everything going on in LA. But I do wish that they would have spent that time on the front end really playing up exactly what was going on in the studio and with Walt and just the US in general. And how big a deal it was. I
Yeah.
mean, could you imagine now that, I mean, this would be like somebody walking up to Spielberg from the State Department and being like, "Hey, so this country that we're not getting along with really liked ET. Can you go film a movie there so that they'll
Right.
like us?" Like, that's almost exactly what happened. And that would never, like, one, that it actually happened, and two, that it more or less worked, which is something else that I will say, and I may be getting a little ahead. Spoiler alert, I do wish that they would have done a little bit more at the end when they're wrapping everything up to actually go into, they talk about the movies that he made and how well they were received or not well received. But they don't really say whether or not it actually had any cultural impact, whether or not the trip actually worked.
Yeah.
Yeah, the movies were financial success, but did it work to improve America's image? They don't really say.
Well,
And I
and
do wish they would have said.
one of the lines that I saw, and I'm reading this off a screen, says that President Roosevelt sent Disney to Latin America where the influence of Nazis and fascists was growing. So,
Hmm.
so I mean, that is in itself is so cloak and dagger, that they're doing this, kind of like you said, the whole like how crazy this is. If Spielberg was sent somewhere, that you're right. Did this make an influence? Did this change your minds? And it seems like it kind of did work in a little bit in a way.
It did, yeah. I mean, I think it was when they went to, gosh, was it Maltonado?
You're
Where they
you're
did
you're way above my pay grade when you start using words like that.
the. One of the cities that they went to, I think it was Maltonado. They they actually had a big banner for Walt, I guess at some point. One of the daughters or one of the children, which I thought was a really cool element, that you had the kids of these animators and the wives reading the letters that they got back from South America to kind of tell the story. But there was one part where one of the letters said something to the effect of, a banner was put up, saying "Welcome Walt Disney," and then it said something to the effect of at the bottom that the German ambassador had been asked to leave.
Hmm.
So to your point, I think it kind of worked, but I wish we would have gotten more information like that.
Yeah, and it did.
Um,
It felt like a historical document in a lot of ways. Of
mhm,
of like this is where Walt slept, and this is where they partied, and this is the lobby where the animators sat. And so they kind of, and again, there were a lot of details in it that I had to do extra research on to try to
uh-huh.
fill in the gaps. So like there were 18 of them that went, 15 animators plus Walt and two spouses. They went on this trip. They left May of 1941, and from what I can tell, they boarded the Santa Clara to come back on October 4th. I'm not really sure how long it took them to get back on the boat, but so it. I mean, it was May. It was. I'm not May. I'm sorry. Let me back up. It was August that they went. May was when the
Mhm.
strike happened.
Yeah.
It was August when they left to go to the Goodwill tour. So they were there August, September, came back 1st of October. So it was really about 2 months that they were there. I go to Disney World for 7 days, and it seems like a long time. So to go for 2 months to countries that you really don't know what's happening with 18 people in your El Grupo seems like a pretty major trip. And then it said in there that the government had offered to pay for it and then also back the movies in case there was any in case they didn't make money, but in the
Mhm.
end they did end up making money.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, it's so wild to think about that ever actually happened. Something that I also thought was really cool that I didn't realize was, and again, and I'll just get this out of the way now. Again, great documentary, um, but I do feel like they could have done a little bit more to dive into some of the details. It seemed very. They kind of do just one big overview of the entire trip, and I wish they would have made it, even if it was a hair longer, a little bit more into the detail. So, one thing that they kind of touched on, and again, they didn't really go into a whole lot of detail, although it wasn't her story, but was the comments about Mary Blair and
Hmm.
her art and how going to Latin America influenced her art and influenced her style. And, especially she's so well known for the color and patterns and the way that she mixed things and paired things that you would never think would go together, and how Latin America played that part. And it influenced, I mean, gosh, it influenced Alice and Peter Pan and Small World and the Contemporary. I mean,
Okay.
that's something that I wish they would have touched on, is the mural at the Contemporary, because and I don't remember a whole lot of the history, which is bad because I work there and they give you like a whole 20-minute speech on the mural in the concourse. But I mean, that mural, I have to imagine, even if it wasn't taken from art that she sketched while she was down there, was very clearly heavily influenced by her time in Latin America.
Yeah, I agree 100%. That part, like, I actually stopped in that part of the movie, even found it so interesting when they were talking about it. And to your point, really did think, yeah, okay, so this is 1941, Small World is until 64. They obviously, this was early influences for her, and what a game changer this was. And she, according to the documentary, almost didn't get on this trip, that she had to go and kind of fight for
Yeah.
her case to go on the trip.
Hmm. Yeah, so that was really fascinating, and I guess just thank you, Walt, that you let her go and influence her art so much that played such a big role in the future of the movies and the parks.
Yeah. So you were saying they didn't really kind of outline much of of what kind of the trip itself, and one of the things that they talked about were they were going to the ABC countries, so Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. And I thought that was kind of cute and kind of cool. And they talk about different cities. So in Brazil they were in Rio, and in Argentina they're in Buenos Aires. And I think it's interesting that all these people who are reading letters that were sent to them, like daughters and wives, are reading these letters in the documentary. They say BA instead of Buenos Aires, which
Hmm.
I guess I wonder, was that just a shortcut because they were writing a letter, or did they refer to it as BA when they were down there? So just a lot of little things that I want to know, and I don't know if the problem is that the Imagineering story was so well done that it kind of spoiled me for any documentaries moving forward, or if there was just too much information to relay in an hour and 47 minutes in this documentary.
I think that's more where it struggled, is that there was so much information. And to be critical again for a minute, the one thing, especially rewatching it, that I didn't necessarily enjoy was all of the, I guess you could call it stock footage
Mm,
of the different locales. Like some stock footage was great, but there were times where it felt like I was entering into like a travel channel kind of like moment, like a travel channel host was about to pop out and tell me about the countries. And
right.
that's not really what the documentary, at least the way it's set up, was its purpose was to talk about the countries. On the flip side of that, it was very cool when they went back to these specific places that Walt and the group had been, and they almost superimposed the footage of Walt and the group with like today, and you could see like where they actually were, and they had all of that footage. And I don't wonder if it wasn't a struggle because there was so much information, but at the same time not a lot, because again, I think a lot of it was contained in personal letters. It doesn't sound whether the and I didn't dig into it enough to see who may have still been alive in '08 that actually went on the trip that they could have interviewed, but I don't believe that anybody was, which is why they went with interviewing wives and children.
Right.
So I think that was kind of part of their struggle too, like how do we convey what happened on the trip when we don't have any first source of who was actually there anymore.
Yeah, and yeah, great point, because they'll show photographs and they show some footage that were obviously made with home cameras, and they show the modern day or 2008 modern day them reading the letters or telling the stories about what had happened during the trip. So it does lack a lot of that actual footage that you would hope that they would have had for something like this. One of the things that I also thought was fascinating is that now when they do a movie, they go and do these site locations very similar to this. And if you think about
Mm-hmm.
this as just like a recon trip to do movies, they send all these animators and they come back and they try to stay very true to the story and to the culture and to the scenes and things like that. And last week I did Lilo and Stitch with a friend of mine from Hawaii, and he was saying that they were so true to Hawaii when they were doing Lilo and Stitch. All the details were so important that it was well accepted there. They make mention of the fact that even though these people went over and they did this research, that they weren't necessarily the only ones working on the movies when they came back, and they added a lot of other things that were maybe not as sensitive to the culture, or gags that you could tell in other footage. This actually may have hurt the product a little bit when they released it.
Mm-hmm. And you kind of got that too, again, and that's why I wish they would have gone into more detail about whether or not it actually worked. Because at the end, when they do start talking about the movies, and I always butcher the one that is not Three Caballeros, so
Saludos
if,
amigos.
there you go.
Okay.
I don't know why, but I do. Um, but yeah, especially when they were talking, and they didn't really even talk about Three Caballeros
Yeah.
at all, which was disappointing because of the two, that's clearly the one that's beloved and still, I think, more watched and known in the Disney community. Um, but they kind of make mention of that nobody was really happy overall except for maybe Brazil, um, fully with their representation in the movie.
Yeah.
And so that's why I would be curious. They say, okay, yeah, it was a financial success and everything, but again, did it actually work to do what it accomplished? Because the two people from Argentina flat out said that they didn't like it.
Right. No, that's a good
um,
point. And Panchito is actually from Mexico, in the Three Caballeros, and they didn't.
mhm.
That, to my knowledge, it wasn't part of the Goodwill tour. So the idea that they
No.
were representing Mexico here seems like they should have, if they went to the ABC countries, they should have had maybe three characters, one from each country, that would represent each of those cultures, and then have Donald talk with each of them. So it was interesting to me, like looking back into it, like, oh, okay, Panchito's from Mexico. What? Why? What? How did that happen for this movie?
Well,
But
I think if memory serves, and it's been a while since I've watched Saludos Amigos, but if memory serves, he was actually from Brazil in that movie, but then they switched it, I think, in Three Caballeros and made him from Mexico. I may be completely misremembering that. Because, and the only reason why I say that is because they do specifically in this movie talk about Panchito when they're talking about the representation of Brazil.
yeah.
So I think that might be the case. But again, even still, that's true, and I wish they would have gone into more detail because Three Caballeros didn't come out till 44.
Right.
Um,
And
so
there's a lot of interesting. There was a little bit of footage that looked like it came from the movies, but it wasn't a lot. And so,
mm-mm.
do you think it's that they didn't have the rights to? I mean, this was like the
I would.
Walt Disney Foundation that put this movie together.
It was it was the Walt Disney Family Foundation,
Yes.
which they were one of. But see, they were just one of the producers. Even they weren't even the main people that did the movie. It was a son of one of the animators that went on the trip. That I think actually did the movie and did all the interviews and everything. And again, I wish there was more information out there about the movie because there's not really any, at least not that I was readily available, on how the movie really came about.
Hmm.
Um,
You mean the
and so
documentary, the one that we're talking about?
yeah. Sorry, the documentary, like how exactly it came about. They flashed Disney Family Foundation, so I kind of assumed that, and Diane was in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of assumed that she had something to do with it, but they may not at the time that it came out because it wasn't a sanctioned documentary. They may not have been able to get full rights to the footage, and that may have been the compromise, and that may be why they didn't talk about Three Caballeros.
Yeah, maybe.
But
That's another good point. Like you're talking about, they don't say how it came to be with the movie The Boys, which you
mhm.
mentioned earlier, which I love that one.
Oh my gosh,
That is such
so
a
great.
well done story, and they tell you how that came about. That these were the
Hmm.
sons of the Sherman brothers, and that they had never
The
really,
cousins,
yeah, they'd
yeah.
never known each other, and they were confused as to why, and started sharing stories, and realized what had transpired, and decided to make a movie about it to tell the story. And again, that one is just such a well done story. This one, there are photos. There are, like we talked about, like videos. There's the interviews, the letters, and then some weird like choices of music. And I guess that was thrown in to show the flavor of the countries.
I
Um,
think so. That was the impression that I got.
and a lot of subtitles too, which I don't always do
Mhm.
well with subtitles. A lot of
No, it was
reading.
sometimes hard. Like I would have to pause and read and then restart to
Yeah.
make sure that I was understanding. I will say though, and again, if for nothing else, I am a sucker for any candid footage of Walt or hearing old interviews where he's just talking. And it did have a lot of that, and that was a lot of fun to watch him with the gauchos or at the one of the dance parties that they had, watching the guys dance and trying to dance with them, like that kind of footage that in a way humanizes Walt in a way that I don't think we get to see a whole lot of anymore. I mean, or
Yeah.
that they don't put to the forefront very much. I'm a sucker for all of that. So that was really, really cool to see, and kind of teary eyed from moment to moment,
Yeah.
thinking,
I love that when he was in the pool, and you see him kind of just being very playful.
hmm
Definitely, again, footage you wouldn't normally see. and he, didn't have a very rough dad bod, so that good for him. But you were talking about like kind of the warmer side, seeing Diane show the dolls that she and her sister had gotten when her mom and dad came back from the trip, and how special those dolls were to them, was an amazing moment to see that kind of thing too. So you're right, it is a very warm thing. But when you talk about the footage we do see of Walt, there's the Walt Disney Story that used to be on Main Street, and the Walt Disney Presents, and the story that you see there in the parks. They don't always talk about the bad times, and I think that to me, again, the strike was such a bookend situation here. They started from the beginning to talk about how bad things were, and maybe Walt left because not only did he want to go on this tour and also have a way to make some money for these movies, but he wanted to get away from that situation. And they talk about the people who were over there and these letters they're writing, and them saying, we're not really looking forward to coming back to the studio because the culture changed so drastically from the time this movie starts to the time this movie ends. So I do think it's kind of like, even though this is about the trip, I think that the strike is a big part of this, and again, a part that we don't normally get exposed to.
Right. Yeah, no. I mean, in this, and they went into a little bit more detail, I feel like, in this, because again, they did play, and they don't, I'm sure you could probably watch like the full credits and figure out what interview it was, but at the beginning, they have an interview from Walt where he's kind of talking about the strike, and one of the head animators came to him and said, hey, Walt, no, we're with you. And then that's when the union guys came in, and they actually have him kind of talking about it in his own words. But to your point, they still kind of gloss over it. Like it's just, the strike happened, or, the union guy came in and the strike happened, and then Disney went to South America. Like they don't. Right. They don't really talk, and all they say is, I forget who, I guess it was Roy, back in California, because Roy didn't go on the trip.
Right.
Roy was settling the strike back in California. But they don't even, I would have to imagine that even while he was gone, he was getting updates and things on the strike. And so all of that was, again, still kind of glossed over, and they don't really talk a whole lot about the resolution at the end, other than they had to lay off equal amount of union and non-union animators.
Yeah.
And that's really as far as they get into what happened. And then they're just like, oh, the studio changed, and, Walt wasn't very much into animation. Which I wish, again, they would have cited a source for that. I feel like we're being very critical of the movie. I'm sorry. I do enjoy the movie, but I'll be honest, it has it's a good taste. It's a good overview of a story that's not very well told, but it definitely leaves you wanting more.
Yeah.
But I wish that they would have gone into more detail about how the studio changed, and citing a source for animation, because it's not like animation grinded to a halt or Walt completely walked away from animation. It was 41, 42, so Dumbo, Pinocchio, and Fantasia, or no, Dumbo hadn't come out yet. We're still talking Dumbo, Cinderella, Peter Pan, all of these great movies that come out later. And kind of, one of the golden age of Disney kind of has yet to happen. And they're like, yeah, he was kind of over animation.
Yeah. Well, one of the things...
That's the first time I've heard it put that way.
Well, and one of the... when they said that, the first thing I started thinking was, how far was it until he started thinking about Disneyland? And this was 41, sure. 42. Disneyland was 55. So, obviously, there was some time in between where he had to do something if animation wasn't it. But, speaking of animation, so I pulled up the list. Dumbo came out in October of 41, so they were already working on that one when that happened. Fantasia had already come out because they talked about one of the parties that they were at. They used like Fantasia decorations to welcome Walt and make him feel welcome there.
Yeah, and they even did, and I wish that they had shown more footage. Again, I wish that they would have shown, because they actually went to one of the cities that they arrived at. When they went to a premiere of Fantasia in South America, but they don't really talk anything about the premiere or what happened. I would have to imagine that there was, photos and crews and video of it, and they don't show any of it.
That is weird. So here's the thing though about animation in general about this time is that they started making what they called these amalgam movies, which were these anthology movies of all these shorts that were put together because he could have smaller teams working on these shorts that they would then string together either with a narrator or with thin storyline that would connect them. And so in 1942 it started really with Saludos Amigos and then went through movies like Fun and Fancy Free, Make Mine Music, Melody Time, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, and it really lasted until like 1949 because of the war, because it was hard to get the animators to do things because you had it was post the strike, but also war was happening and people were getting called off to war. So you had that, and then they didn't have a lot of funding. So these movies were just really kind of strung together, but they still count as a full-length animated feature.
True.
So there was one that they kind of miss in the middle, though, which was one that they did, which was a propaganda movie, which was called Victory Through Air Power, which got released in 1943. So Saludos Amigos was 42, and then Three Caballeros was 44, but in between was this Victory Through Air Power. So they were still doing a lot of animation, but it wasn't the same as Pinocchio, Fantasia, Snow White, and and Dumbo. It was these kind of these pushed together movies.
And right. No, and I had forgotten about those, and it does make sense, but that's where I kind of took issue with them saying that Walt checked out of animation because of the strike.
Yeah.
Like, I think, admittedly, it was different.
Right.
But I almost feel like Disneyland almost would have happened sooner had he completely checked out. Like, clearly because of the war, he couldn't do what he wanted to do, but they never stopped thinking about animation. I mean, they kind of started and stopped on Sleeping Beauty a couple of times during the war, but couldn't get it going until afterwards. So, and that's where I wish that there would have been, when they made those kinds of comments in the movie, like, cite your source, like,
right.
Have some kind of, I mean, you had all of this, again, great information from the letters and everything. And again, you played interviews from Walt. If you had something from him talking about the strike at its resolution, I wish we could have heard that too.
Yeah. No, it probably just poorly worded saying he checked out, because I do think he was disheartened.
Possibly.
He was disheartened because he felt like...
That's a better word for it.
He felt like these were family, all of these animators that he worked with, and that he was the dad or the uncle, and he was out there and he was inspiring them, and he, was a part of all this. And then when this turned into a union issue, I think that probably broke his heart a little bit, that he, probably didn't see... obviously these guys needed to make more money, and that's why the strike happened. But I think he probably felt very personally attacked by that, which probably made it maybe less fun at the time. But if you go into Saving Mr. Banks, you see in him portrayed in that movie that he's really still, into the idea of mixing animation and live action. And so I think he was always about the cutting edge and moving forward. So let me break away from this for a second and talk about something that is relatively related, but not exactly, and something that's in your wheelhouse and mine, which is how this relates back to the parks. So,
right.
so we, you and I, we share that bond with the blog. The parks are awesome. When I think about this movie and how important a moment this was, that maybe this even saved the relationship between South America and North America during the Great War. What does this mean to the company? And then looking at it now, I mean, Brazil almost happened as a country in World Showcase. May still happen. Who knows where that project is right now. But other than the boat ride with the Three Caballeros, and then going back even further to the Mickey Mouse Revue, which used to be at the Magic Kingdom, which had the animatronics that are now at the Three Caballeros, or the boat ride in Mexico. There really isn't a lot about South America in the parks, and that seems weird to me.
It does, because again, I mean, this seems like it was, for better or worse, and I think in some ways, probably in Walt's mind, excellent timing because of the strike, for him and Lillian to be able to get away. um, it is interesting because I mean a later trip that they took to Switzerland resulted in the Matterhorn.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I get it, the parks weren't a thing when he went to Latin America, but it is very strange that they didn't have a bigger influence. Although, looking at some of the animation and some of the sketches that they showed, that Herb Ryman did and a couple of the other guys did, I almost see touches of Tiki Room.
Okay.
So I don't wonder if maybe that, when he was presented with the idea that maybe that was kind of his callback to Latin America. Obviously, they went more of like a Polynesian route with it to
Right.
fit in Adventureland, but I don't wonder if maybe some of that aesthetic and the birds and everything from the rainforest is kind of what triggered that initial thought.
Okay, that's a fair point.
But yeah, it's just bizarre. I mean, we have, for something that was clearly a big deal, that there's no real reference to it in the parks. And again, up until this documentary, it's not something, and even to this day, it's not something that's widely talked about in Disney circles. I mean, yeah, everybody knows the Three Caballeros, but not many people realize how it came about, which was this Good World Tour. And it's just very bizarre that it doesn't get talked about more. That Disney did this not only for his career, but for his country, really. I
Right.
mean, the U.S. government actually came to him and was like, hey, we need you to represent our entire country and get these people to like us more than the Nazis.
Right. Yeah, I mean,
Use-
that's a great point. I mean, that was our biggest export at the time was Walt Disney and his entertainment to be able to kind of it's like trying to impress a client at a party and bringing in a baseball player, or something
Mhm.
like that. You're really kind of just flexing a little bit, going, "Oh, Walt Disney, we have one of those. Would you like to borrow him?" So I do absolutely think that it was a pivotal thing, and the only thing that I really knew about it until this documentary was that I had a loose understanding that the government did want him to do a goodwill tour, and that what came out of it was Saludos Amigos and Three Caballeros. But I don't know that I knew anything more than that, or how important it was, or how it again tied into the timing of the strike, which I think again it's a very pivotal thing that seems to sort of get swept under the rug a little bit in this movie, is how important
Mhm.
that was to the timing of him going.
Right. Well, and the one thing that I guess we can say about that, because even thinking back to, because I think they even touched on it in the Imagineering story, and they've touched on it in a couple other documentaries, but and your point that he was probably heartbroken about the strike, I think that's more accurate because even in other things, it's not something that's, I mean, it's well documented. You can go out there and find the information, but at least in official Disney things, it's not something that's talked about very much, unless it's like, yep, it happened. Um, but
That was a
although,
thing.
again, this being a slightly outside documentary, I'm surprised that they didn't talk more about what actually went down
Yeah.
with the strike. They show the picket lines and everything. They're like, yep, it's a thing that happened, and then we don't talk about it anymore.
All right. So all of that said, and all of the things that we've kind of picked apart and talked about, and how important this movie is, and yet the delivery style of the documentary, and all of those things considered, Ashley Jasmer, would you recommend this movie?
I still would. Yes, absolutely. I think it's still worth a watch. Um, Again, just for, if nothing else, seeing the original sketch work, the original, all of the candid Walt and Lillian and the group, and all of those nostalgia things that we don't really get a whole lot of just because of the time period that it was done. Um, I would definitely say it's still worth the watch. I would just say be prepared to still have questions at the end.
That's a good point. You know what? For me, again, I appreciate that you brought this up because I had not had a chance to watch it, and I feel like I needed to sit down and make myself watch it. That said, I think that if you're a Disney fan or a history fan, you watch this. If not, it's a little hard to watch between the
Hmm.
subtitles, the jumping back and forth, and the lack of information. This would not be the documentary that I would recommend. So if I was going to recommend a documentary to somebody, I wouldn't recommend necessarily this one. But I do agree with you. I mean, it is an important movie because of the story that it's telling. I just think it could have been told in a better way. And I watched this one by myself. If I had sat the family down with this, they would have been on their devices. They would have been checked out. They would have headed to bed. So for those reasons, that I wouldn't necessarily recommend this movie. But if you are a history fan or a Walt fan, I do think that if it is worth your time. So that's a very mixed message, I know. But again, I wouldn't recommend it. But if you want to see it, it's not a bad movie. So thank you for reviewing that one with me. I really appreciate it. If you guys have watched it, or if you haven't watched it, you have any other comments, we'd love to hear from you below in in the chat. Also, you can hit us up at Deep in the Plus on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. But Ashley, before I let you go, you know how this works. You need to give me your pick of the week. So what are you guys watching?
We are currently rewatching Boy Meets World.
Good pick.
My husband, God bless him, has never actually watched it before.
And you still married him?
I didn't know. I didn't know at the time. I failed as making sure that was a prerequisite. And it was actually my little brother, and my little brother is 10 years younger than I am, saying Feeny, trying to get somebody's attention. I think it was my dad's. And my husband looked so confused, and that's when I realized he had never seen it before. So we have been sitting down and rewatching all the way back from the very beginning when they were in 6th grade, watching Corey and Topanga fall in love, and Sean and all of his teen boy heartthrobness all over again. And it's been fantastic.
And you would recommend going back into it? Does it still hold up?
It does.
Okay.
I personally think it does, especially, and maybe there is a touch of nostalgia there, but again, sitting down and watching it with an adult, my husband, who's never seen it before, even he stays fairly well engaged. And we're talking about watching 6th graders. I mean, it was more timely when I was a 6th grader watching it. But it definitely still holds up in my opinion. After watching random Netflix things or Tiger King, we make the joke like we need some wholesome family goodness, and so we will put on a couple episodes of Boy Meets World.
And have you gotten to the episode where they go to Epcot yet?
No, I am waiting for that episode.
Gosh, I love that one. I have a weird thing about loving all of the half-hour sitcoms that went to the theme parks and watching them randomly.
Not Boy Meets World, but do you remember the Easter egg in Full House?
Easter egg?
Yeah, so DJ's boyfriend, fun fact for those who don't know, in Full House, DJ's boyfriend, Steve, there we go, yep. It's Steve. He actually did the voice of Aladdin in the movies. And when they go, I can't remember, I think they just go to Disneyland. She actually bumps into Steve dressed up as Aladdin, which back in the day was actually really funny because he was Aladdin.
Right.
So that was that fun Easter egg.
Well, for Boy Meets World, I am Team Eric. He was hilarious. The Feeny thing was just so good. Will Friedle and anything he does, I'm on board. So for me, I went back and we watched Black Panther. That's not as deep as what you've been doing, but this is something that, my wife loves this movie, and the MCU with 23 movies is, very vast. And I think that there are a ton of people who during quarantine decided that to keep themselves busy, and maybe they didn't know what they were watching, or maybe they hadn't seen it, they decided to go back and watch all the MCU movies from beginning to end. We didn't do that, but we did pick this one out to watch. And the interesting thing that I think about this one, and it came out in 2018, it was the 18th movie in the MCU. I think it stands alone fairly well. I don't think you have to have watched all the other MCU movies to do this. Now, he gets introduced in Captain America Civil War in the 16th movie, or it may have been, I think it's the 15th movie. So it's like years later, like 2 years later, when this movie comes out after he's already been introduced. And but again, it stands on its own pretty well. I think that being said, if you watch if Avengers Infinity War and Endgame, you need to have seen this one before you see those movies. But I think this one is one where you could just jump in and watch this and not have to watch all the rest of the MCU movies. And there's another one coming in 2022, which who knows if that'll actually happen in 2022 because of COVID-19 and how that slowed down the movie process. But I'm excited to see more Black Panther come along. And again, I would recommend that if you just want one off movie to watch, this is actually a really good one to pick up on just to watch.
Good one. Yeah. That's definitely a great one. Out of all of them, I don't remember I think that was in my top 10 when we counted down MCU movies.
Yeah. It's solid. It
definitely is. It holds up. I would argue that it kind of makes more sense if you saw Civil War, only for the setup of the premise that because it picks up basically right after Civil War, and he's traveling back to officially become king.
Yeah.
Which makes sense. But they do explain it fairly well, so you don't necessarily have to have seen Civil War. But it does slightly help, I think.
And I thought of that too. The only thing is I think Civil War has so much going on in it that's tied to the earlier movies because Ant-Man shows up and the whole fight between Cap and Iron Man and how that works out is very there's a lot that goes on there. I agree with you. It's a great origin. It's a great origin for Spider-Man too, Civil War. That's one of my favorite movies because it's kind of in the middle. It linchpins everything together. But I see what you're saying, but I also think that it may bring up more questions than answers for somebody who hasn't seen the movies before it. But again, let us know what you think in the comments. We appreciate any and all feedback. Thank you guys for joining us. Ashley, thank you so much for doing this with me. I appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. It was fun.
And we'll see each other next time we head down to Disney World, right?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a good night.
Bye.
If you like what you're watching, make sure you like and subscribe. You can also find us on social at Deep in the Plus on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you're a Disney Parks fan, don't forget to catch me and Rob on Park Center Wednesday nights at 9 p.m. on WDWNT.com.